January 1945. The island is quiet for the first time in months. Inside a makeshift enclosure near the shoreline, rows of Japanese women sit on the ground, wrapped in thin blankets that do not belong to them. The air smells of antiseptic and wet earth. No artillery. No shouted orders. Only the distant sound of surf and boots moving with unfamiliar restraint. Many are nurses. Others are factory workers, clerks, civilian auxiliaries pulled into the machinery of war. Their bodies carry its record. Infected wounds, untreated fractures, weeks of hunger etched into hollow faces. Some have not slept without fear since the fighting began. American medics move slowly between them. Clipboards, bandages, thermometers. No hurry. No interrogation. Each woman is examined, then told to sit, to wait, to rest. For years, speed meant survival. Orders were absolute. Weakness was punished. Now time itself has changed shape. The war has not ended, but for these women, motion has stopped. They do not yet understand why. And to understand how this moment became possible, the story must begin long before capture, inside the world that sent them into the war. By the time the Pacific War reached its final year, Japanese women were no longer distant from the front lines. They were embedded within it. Imperial Japan had entered the 1930s with a rigidly defined social order. Women were expected to serve the nation through obedience, endurance, and sacrifice. As the war expanded across China and the Pacific, these expectations hardened into policy. By 1941, Japan's total war economy required labor that extended far beyond the battlefield. Women became nurses, clerks, radio operators, factory workers, and logistical support personnel. Others were civilians swept into war zones as the empire expanded and then collapsed. Japanese military nursing units were trained under strict discipline. Medical knowledge existed, but supplies did not. As Allied blockades tightened, shortages became constant. Morphine disappeared. Sterilization became improvised. Bandages were reused. By 1944, even basic nutrition for medical staff was unreliable. Nurses often treated soldiers while suffering from malnutrition themselves. For civilian women in occupied territories, Manchuria, the Philippines, parts of Southeast Asia, the situation was even more precarious. As American forces advanced, Japanese administrative control broke down. Evacuations were incomplete. Women were ordered to remain at posts, destroy documents, and prepare for final resistance. Many were issued grenades or instructed in suicide protocols rather than surrender. This was not rumor. It was doctrine. Imperial training emphasized that capture brought shame worse than death. The enemy, especially Americans, were portrayed as brutal, undisciplined, and vengeful. Stories, some exaggerated, some rooted in isolated incidents, spread quickly. Fear became institutional. By late 1944, the battlefield itself had changed. The island-hopping campaign brought American forces directly into Japan's defensive perimeter. Saipan fell in July. Leyte followed in October. Iwo Jima and Okinawa loomed ahead. Each loss severed supply lines and erased any illusion of a negotiated end. Women stationed on these islands faced impossible conditions. Bombardment destroyed hospitals. Jungle humidity rotted equipment. Dysentery spread through camps faster than medicine. Sleep came in minutes, not hours. Some women continued treating the wounded until collapse. Others were buried alive in caves during shelling. As American landings intensified, Japanese command structures fractured. Orders became contradictory or ceased altogether. Units dissolved. Medical facilities were abandoned. Civilians and auxiliary staff fled into hills and caves alongside soldiers, surviving on roots and rainwater. It was in this chaos that capture occurred, not as a single event, but as a slow erosion of resistance. Hunger forced movement. Wounds forced surrender. For many women, survival itself became an act of quiet defiance against a doctrine that had offered no exit. Yet surrender did not feel like rescue. It felt like stepping into the unknown. And waiting on the other side was an enemy whose methods would challenge everything they had been taught to expect. Across the Pacific, American planners had prepared for surrender long before it began to happen. Experience in North Africa and Europe had already shaped Allied policy toward prisoners of war. By 1943, the U.S. military had formalized procedures governing the treatment of captives. Medical stabilization first, intelligence second, and punishment only in cases of clear violation. These policies were rooted in the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had ratified. Japan had signed but not fully ratified the convention, and its application in the Pacific had been inconsistent. Still, American command viewed adherence as both a moral obligation and a strategic tool. Healthy prisoners were more cooperative. Humane treatment undermined enemy propaganda. In the Pacific theater, the challenge was scale and environment. Island campaigns produced wounded prisoners in terrain that offered little infrastructure. Medical units often landed with assault waves. Field hospitals were constructed from tents, captured buildings, or coral clearings scraped flat by bulldozers. Water had to be purified. Disease had to be contained before it spread. Female prisoners presented a distinct logistical reality. Many arrived malnourished, dehydrated, or injured by shrapnel and cave collapses rather than direct combat. Some had gone weeks without proper food. Others had untreated infections that would have been fatal within days. American medics were instructed to stabilize first fluids, nutrition, wound cleaning, before any further processing. There was also the matter of expectation. American soldiers had been conditioned to expect resistance until death. Japanese civilians and auxiliaries, particularly women, had been described as likely to resist or self-harm upon capture. For that reason, initial handling emphasized calm control. Weapons were removed. Physical distance was maintained. Medical care was deliberately visible. In places like Saipan and Okinawa, this approach played out repeatedly. Women emerged from caves under white flags or were carried by stretcher teams after bombardment. They were separated from male prisoners, not for punishment, but for medical triage. American nurses, both Army and Navy, were often present, bringing a professional familiarity that cut through fear even when language failed. Time became the defining difference. There was no immediate demand for labor, no forced marches, no shouted ideology. Captured women were told to sit, to rest, to wait their turn. Food was issued in controlled portions to avoid shock. Blankets were distributed. Wounds were documented, not ignored. For women trained to expect humiliation or execution, the absence of violence was disorienting. Care itself felt suspicious. Some refused food at first. Others remained rigid, waiting for a punishment that did not come. But hours passed, then days. And with each passing day, a realization began to form, not of freedom, but of survival without urgency. A pause in the machinery of war. That pause would reshape how these women experience captivity, and it opens the story to be understood from several angles at once. The human angle. The first reality American medics encountered was physical collapse. Japanese women arrived with bodies already spent by years of rationing and months of siege. Many weighed far below healthy levels. Skin infections spread unchecked. Cuts had turned septic. Fevers had gone untreated because there were no drugs left to give. Some women could not stand without assistance. Others had been walking on fractured bones, the pain dulled only by exhaustion. Silence was common. Not defiance, but conservation. Energy was precious. When ordered to sit, many did so with relief rather than resistance. Sleep came suddenly, in public without fear. For women who had learned to remain alert at all times, unconsciousness itself felt dangerous. Yet it arrived anyway, unstoppable. The medical angle. American field medicine in 1945 was not gentle, but it was systematic. Triage was swift. Wounds were cleaned with iodine or sulfa powder. Infections were isolated. Quarantine tents were erected for dysentery and malaria cases. Nutrition was reintroduced carefully, broth before solids, measured calories, constant observation. There was no rush to return these women to usefulness. Healing was not conditional. That alone marked a sharp break from their experience under Japanese military doctrine, where care existed to return soldiers to the front as quickly as possible. The cultural angle. For Japanese women, endurance had always been framed as duty. Pain was expected. Complaints were shameful. The idea that weakness might be met with patience rather than discipline conflicted with everything they had been taught. Some apologized repeatedly. Others bowed reflexively. A few resisted treatment, fearing it carried hidden consequences. But American procedures did not change. The repetition mattered. Examination, rest, food. Again and again. Slowly, expectations shifted, not toward trust, but toward acceptance. And in that acceptance, deeper contrasts began to emerge, revealing how leadership, morality, and enemy perception shaped this unexpected pause in violence. The leadership and logistics angle. Behind the calm of the medical tents was a rigid logistical framework. American commanders understood that disease could destroy an army as efficiently as enemy fire. In the Pacific, malaria, dysentery, and infection were constant threats. Treating prisoners was not charity alone, it was containment. Stabilized captives reduced the risk of outbreaks, simplified security, and freed combat units to continue operations. Orders issued to medical officers emphasized uniform standards. Prisoners were to receive care equivalent to that given to Allied wounded, within the limits of supply. This applied regardless of gender. The result was consistency. Healing was not left to individual discretion or emotion. It was procedure. The moral contrast angle. 4 Japanese women raised under a system that fused obedience with worth. The absence of coercion was unsettling. No demands were placed on them beyond compliance with treatment. No ideological lectures followed. The Americans did not ask them to denounce their emperor or explain their loyalty. They asked about pain, about fever, about appetite. The moral weight of this contrast did not announce itself loudly. It accumulated quietly. Each uneventful day eroded the certainty that surrender meant degradation. Mercy, delivered without ceremony, became more disruptive than violence. The enemy perception angle. Propaganda had framed Americans as reckless and cruel. Yet the enemy now controlled time itself. They decided when meals were served, when wounds were cleaned, when sleep was allowed. And they chose restraint. For some women, this created confusion rather than gratitude. If the enemy could afford patience, what did that say about the war they had been fighting? If survival was permitted, what purpose had sacrifice served? These questions had no immediate answers, but they lingered, waiting for a moment when the war itself would turn decisively, transforming temporary care into a lasting outcome. That moment arrived in the summer of 1945. April 1945. Okinawa. The last great battle of the Pacific begins with overwhelming force. More than 1,300 Allied ships line the horizon. The island is saturated with artillery fire before the first troops land. For Japanese forces, Okinawa is not just another defensive position. It is the final barrier before the home islands. Civilians and military auxiliaries are pulled into the battle by necessity. Hospitals are moved underground. Nurses treat casualties in limestone caves lit by candles and flashlights. Supplies run out within days. Water becomes contaminated. American naval bombardment collapses entrances, trapping the wounded and those caring for them inside. As the fighting grinds on, capture accelerates. Women emerge from shattered medical posts carrying improvised white cloths. Others are found by American patrols, unconscious from dehydration or blast shock. Many are too weak to resist, even if they had wanted to. American medical response is immediate but controlled. Field hospitals expand rapidly behind the lines. Quarantine areas are marked. Japanese women are registered, examined, and separated from active combat zones. The pace of care contrasts sharply with the violence still unfolding only miles away. In May and June, the scale increases. Hundreds of women pass through medical stations, each week. Some require surgery. Others simply require rest, days of uninterrupted sleep, food, and hydration. This is the turning point. For the first time, survival is no longer momentary. It is sustained. The expectation of immediate death dissolves into something unfamiliar, a future measured in recovery schedules rather than shelling timetables. But Okinawa is not the end. It is the threshold, and what follows will confirm that this pause in violence is not temporary policy, but the beginning of a larger transformation. August 1945. The war ends not with silence, but with exhaustion. When Japan announces its acceptance of Allied terms on August 15th, the machinery of violence does not stop instantly. Units await confirmation. Commands are clarified. Weapons are collected. But one fact is undeniable. The urgency that defined every decision for years has evaporated. 4 Japanese women already in American custody. The shift is immediate. Medical routines do not tighten. They slow. Temporary facilities become semi-permanent. Records are updated. Recovery plans replace emergency triage. Nutrition improves. Fresh vegetables and protein supplements are introduced gradually. Dental care begins for the first time in years. Chronic conditions, tuberculosis, anemia, parasitic infections, are treated not as liabilities, but as responsibilities. Healing is no longer preparation for return to duty. It is an end in itself. Interrogation, when it occurs, is delayed. Women are questioned only after stabilization, often weeks later, and many are never questioned at all. The absence of pressure becomes its own confirmation. They are not bargaining chips. They are patients. For those transferred to larger holding centers in the Philippines, Guam, or Okinawa, the pattern repeats. Time is structured around care, not compliance. Days are predictable. Nights are quiet. The realization settles gradually. Not through announcement, but through repetition. No one comes to rush them back into danger. No order arrives demanding sacrifice. The enemy has chosen preservation. This is the moment belief changes. Not an ideology, not an allegiance, but an expectation. Survival is no longer borrowed. It is allowed. And with that allowance, the war's consequences begin to unfold beyond the battlefield, shaping what comes after captivity ends. The weeks following Japan's surrender bring a new phase of accounting. 4 Japanese women held in American custody. Survival becomes a matter of documentation rather than improvisation. Medical records are finalized. Weights are recorded. Recovery progress is measured in steady, unemotional increments. Repatriation planning begins almost immediately. Women deemed medically stable are transferred in groups. Transportation is slow and deliberate. Ships are not overcrowded. Quarantine protocols remain in place to prevent the spread of disease across the Pacific. Those still recovering remain where they are, sometimes for months. The physical toll of the war is undeniable. Many women carry permanent damage, impaired lungs from untreated infections, weakened bones from long-term malnutrition, hearing loss from bombardment. Some will never fully regain strength. But the mortality rate drops sharply once stabilization is achieved. Death, which had felt inevitable under siege, becomes rare under sustained care. American medical officers submit reports noting the severity of pre-capture conditions. These documents, preserved in military archives, describe patients arriving in advanced states of exhaustion, suffering from ailments rarely seen among Allied troops at that stage of the war. The contrast reinforces what field medics already understood. Survival depended less on ideology than on access to time, nutrition, and basic medical order. For the women themselves, recovery is uneven. Some regain health quickly once fed and rested. Others struggle with lingering weakness and psychological numbness. But the environment remains consistent. There are no forced marches, no punishment for slowness, no return to combat labor. As transport schedules firm and destinations are assigned, anticipation replaces fear. The future remains uncertain, but it exists. And beyond individual survival, these outcomes begin to shape how the war is remembered, recorded, and judged particularly in the space between victory and reconciliation. When repatriation finally occurs, it does not feel like a victory march. Japanese women return to a country altered beyond recognition. Cities lie in ruins. Families are displaced or gone. Food shortages continue. The structure that once defined duty and obedience has collapsed along with the empire that enforced it. For many former prisoners, reintegration is quiet and solitary. There are no public accounts, no official ceremonies. Some women never speak of captivity at all. Others record their experiences privately, in diaries or post-war testimonies collected years later. What emerges from these records is not gratitude in simple terms, but dissonance. They had expected brutality. They encountered order. They had prepared for death. They were given time. Psychological consequences surfaced slowly. Survivors described confusion rather than relief during captivity. Care without demand felt unnatural. Rest without guilt took time to accept. In a society rebuilding itself under occupation, these memories exist alongside loss and shame, complicating how the war is processed internally. On the American side, the episode becomes part of a broader institutional narrative. Medical Corps reports and occupation records emphasize disease control, stabilization, and humane procedure. These documents are not written to celebrate compassion, but to demonstrate effectiveness. Yet their cumulative effect reinforces a strategic truth. Restraint can be as decisive as force. The treatment of Japanese women POWs feeds into post-war policy. During the occupation of Japan, medical infrastructure becomes a priority. Public health campaigns, nutrition programs, and hospital reforms draw on lessons learned in wartime captivity. Healing is reframed as reconstruction. In a long arc of memory, these women occupy a narrow space between enemy and civilian, between combatant and patient. Their survival challenges simplified versions of total war. It shows that even at its most destructive, conflict still contains choices. Those choices did not erase suffering, but they altered outcomes. And in that alteration lies the meaning that endures beyond statistics and surrender dates. War is often measured by momentum, by how quickly armies advance, how decisively battles are won, how completely enemies are broken. In the Pacific, speed defined survival. Hesitation invited destruction. For years, everything moved forward without pause. 4 Japanese women caught inside that machinery. Time had been an enemy. There was never enough of it. To heal, to grieve, to question. Endurance replaced recovery. Obedience replaced care. Survival depended on pushing the body beyond its limits again and again. American captivity introduced something unfamiliar: stillness. Not freedom, not forgiveness, but an enforced pause. Wounds were allowed to close. Illnesses were treated without deadlines. Hunger was addressed methodically rather than desperately. Healing was not tied to usefulness. This did not undo the war. It did not erase the fear, the loss, or the weight of defeat, but it changed trajectories. Lives that would have ended in caves or on forced marches extended into uncertain futures. In the history of World War II, this moment rarely occupies center stage. It lacks spectacle. There are no decisive charges or surrender ceremonies. Yet its significance is quiet and enduring. It demonstrates that restraint, applied consistently, can reshape outcomes even in total war. The women who survived did not leave as symbols. They left as patients who had been allowed to live long enough to recover. And sometimes, in the aftermath of destruction, that allowance is the most consequential act of all.